Welcome to Quantum Business Insights, emerging perspectives on people, process, and profits. Your host is Olivia Parr-Rud. In today's fast-paced, high-tech global economy, the business landscape is constantly evolving. To be successful, companies must continually adapt as well as identify and exploit new opportunities. Now, here is the host of Quantum Business Insights, Olivia Parr-Rud.
Welcome to Quantum Business Insights. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Each week on Quantum Business Insights, I explore the changing nature of business with thought leaders from around the world. My hope is that through deep dialogue and inquiry, we'll discover new perspectives and approaches that can help us all be more successful in our business. I especially want to draw attention to those systems and processes that take advantage of what I feel is our most valuable asset, our human capital. So the topic for today's show is integrating collaboration with competition in business, government, and society. And I'm delighted to have as my guest a friend, Michael Sussman, founder of On Track America, which is a nonprofit organization helping the North American rail industry and government collaborate across agencies, companies, regions, and other stakeholder groups. Michael also has a consulting company, Strategic Rail Finance, where he and his team apply collaborative principles to financing the most challenging situations. This allows him to create funding breakthroughs for his clients that incorporate multiple lenders and government entities. So you can imagine how challenging that is. Michael's new company, Enact Solution, is developing a software program which facilitates his work. And I don't want to say any more because I'm going to let him tell you about it. But finally, what I love about Michael's approach is that he designed his career in railroad finance, government consulting, and multi-party relations with the specific intention of forging new ground in aligning commercial activity and related public policy to support the long-term best interests of the common good. Michael, welcome to Quantum Business Insights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivia. I've been looking forward to this event ever since you invited me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So, Michael, you seem to be a businessman that seeks to work with government at a time when so many are decrying government and promoting business as a solution to our biggest challenges in our society. Why do you take this approach? Do you not think the private sector is capable of solving these problems?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. I found in relating to folks in government that they have what is now no longer surprising to me, but they have a surprising commitment to impacting the areas that their agency or department is involved in. And I think that just that perspective alone, and that came from going to Washington over and over and over again throughout the 90s and ever since. And you know, they're among the best and brightest in the country that go there. And I found that it's not the people that's the problem. There's nothing inherent about people in government, but our systems for thinking together and coordinating with business fall short. And then so often folks in business appeal to government from the perspective of a narrow vested interest. And our work is about expanding the playing field so that business and government can coordinate much better together.
So you see really business can't do it by itself, that it really needs the government kind of structure and the expanded connection, would you say?
Yeah, there's so much that government can't do, but then there's so much that business really can't do. And I see the role of government really as the facilitator and coordinator of the various interested parties. And in that role, you know, government can be so effective and in many ways is effective. But they're so often hamstrung by that we don't really yet have the forums and the methods in place to do large-scale systemic coordination and collaboration.
And as you said, a lot of the time businesses have their own interests and maybe don't see the greater good as one of their goals. So it really would take something like the government to guide them. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I believe that what we have in business is that we've adopted a driving principle, and we adopted it primarily in the United States in the 19th century, when we were really looking at what the role of business was going to be and what the role of government was going to be and how were they going to relate to each other. And we really adopted the driving principle of competition and expecting, and that's where I believe that we went astray, and it's time to really bring forward a new driving principle.
So you're advocating for collaboration, and business is advocating for competition and actually selling it as the solution. But they seem to be really opposing forces. How do you see that playing out in business and economics?
Well, I think if we look at where competition has gotten us in both business and society and community, and now what we're seeing in government, is that it's really an incomplete and insufficient principle for organizing, systems and large commercial arenas.
How so?
Well, there's competition in certain areas, finite areas, where the goal is to have a market that allows people to come in and compete for attention, test their mettle, bring their best ideas forward, bring their products forward, compete for who can produce products the most economically. And that's appropriate for sort of particular product areas.
Give me an example of that. Can you?
The toothpaste, beer, video games.
Okay.
But when it comes to whole arenas of industrial activity and whole infrastructure systems and whole systems for delivering important services to society and to communities, competition is not adequate for all. One, it has folks think individually and narrowly, when what's needed is thinking of the whole system and to think of not only how do I win, but how does the whole system win, and how can I win by the whole system winning? Well,
can I just say, too, what the first thing comes to mind is that businesses are so closely tied for even survival to their quarterly profits. So that becomes a challenge. Is that true?
Well, we certainly have structured everything around competition to this point. So there are going to be structural issues and challenges that we would need to deal with as, my vision and perhaps your vision and many of your listeners' vision comes to fruition, where we actually do coordinate around collaboration. And those issues of, how do we support those businesses that are enmeshed in competition, and even those that are enmeshed in producing goods and services that aren't good for our society? How do we support them in making the transition to producing goods and services that are positive? And I think one of the things that's been a block that's been there in our thinking is that as we support and demand or regulate away from more harmful activities, I think we have to also expand our thinking to include how are we going to steward or shepherd or support those companies with good people in them and good employees? How are we going to support them into more positive activities? Whereas up till now, in a competitive framework, the notion is that, with regulation, with new laws, with the need to have businesses do more to address pressing social issues, that somehow they're going to just have to lose.
Mm-hmm. It seems like it's been a stick approach up until now, and maybe you're proposing sort of a carrot, like let's reward or incent or come up with measures that actually help the company go in a better direction. Is that
exactly? Yes.
Okay. That's great. So how does collaboration? How is it useful in financial work? Maybe you could give us examples of that.
Sure. Well, if I can dare take it at the highest level, I would because
go for it.
All right, good. And it comes all the way down to doing individual finance transactions. But when we step back and look at finance and movement of capital and investment based on a competitive framework and a competitive drive, we have what I believe is the most influential organizing principle in our civilization right now is that we are we are supposed to, if we're smart, if we're a good businessman, if we're a good financier, we're supposed to move capital into systems and countries and regions and industries and businesses to where you get the highest return on investment.
Okay.
And that has us moving capital, and before that benefits of that capital get to expand and generate and produce synergistic benefits for the stakeholders or that community or that country, we're already taking that capital back out in terms of profits and leaving the systems, the countries, industries with as little of the benefit of that capital that came in and maximizing the benefit to those that brought the capital in. And that is what I believe is essentially really the key problem we have right now in the world, and that based in collaboration, the notion would be thinking about and implementing capital and finance, moving into systems, countries, industries, companies, in a way that maximizes the benefit of that capital to that system. And out of that, we get our return on investment. In that notion, we have allow for the collaboration amongst the stakeholders, the owners, the employees, the parties, the communities. So that's on the biggest level, and I think it's key to deriving benefit from collaboration right down to the smallest transactions.
So based on what you were saying, it sounds like that's kind of what happened that led to the financial collapse, that people were grabbing money out before it really was distributed. Or, I mean, there were obviously other problems, yes, but it was that thinking like, I'm going to just skim my profits off the top, and whatever's left, there may be losses, I don't care. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes. I'm so focused on modeling what collaborative approaches to commerce and related public policy and finance would look like in my case, the rail industry. Mm-hmm. In North America, that there's a lot of the larger economic developments that I don't ground myself in, but your question seems to hit the nail on the head. It's another case of moving capital in. I think we're born into that, especially in the West, especially in the United States, where if we're smart, we are one of the people that moves capital and gets the highest return on investment as quick as possible.
Yeah, I always laugh or kind of chuckle when I hear somebody's majoring in finance, because the prospects of them being very wealthy are huge, and I think it's all based on that kind of paradigm. as long as I've known you, you've been involved in the railroad industry. You mentioned that. Why did you pick that industry? What is it about the railroad industry that you feel is so important as far as collaboration?
Sure. In the early, I guess 1983, and throughout the 80s, and we were looking at the possibility of no more, World War, and that really the primary form of international relations was going to shift to business. And I thought, well, if we do business in the same way that we do war, in other words, if we unleash competition as the primary form of interaction, then we're not going to accomplish the overall goals of peace and prosperity and sustainability through business, any better than we would by, World War. And we really needed, I thought, a new model for how business is conducted. So I started looking around for, all right, where am I going to demonstrate this? And I was introduced to a small privately owned railroad, of which we have, all over the United States and Canada and Mexico, 600 in the United States. And I found that that we move heavy weight over land on railroads on 1/2 to 1/4 of the amount of diesel fuel as the same movement on a truck and the highway system. Yet for over 100 years now, we've been shrinking our network of rail lines and expanding our network of roads and highways and orienting much of our logistics around trucks, which are necessary within an integrated multimodal system, but overall they cause a lot more pollution, congestion, traffic congestion, safety issues. And I thought, well, why is it that capital isn't moving toward this efficient mode of transportation? And I thought, well, that would be an ideal place, an ideal industrial sector, particularly with its significant relations to land use and public policy, to demonstrate new principles for bringing capital into an industry. As I, learned more about the industry and immersed myself in the history of it and how it was, how we got to be this place at the beginning of the 21st century where rail was no longer the predominant form of transportation as it was 100 years ago. And I thought, this is a place, if I can show that bringing capital into this industry in a way that produces maximum benefits to the industry, that would be the model that we really need in industries and industrial sectors in the United States and around the world.
Wow.
So that was, yeah.
Well, so tell me some of the challenges that came up when you started working with this kind of model.
Well, I found the first thing, and it was what actually this was my first experience in the industry, was that in solving the financing challenge of one of the smaller railroads, I saw that there was a big dichotomy between access to capital amongst the big railroads, the large trunk lines that are publicly owned and cross, thousands of miles across North America, that they have ample access to capital, although not as much as many other booming, growing industries that, in technology where we see, so much capital moving in advance of the system already being built out, and that the smaller railroads were being starved for capital. And the predominant thinking in the industry was toward moving as much traffic on the trunk lines and sort of diminishing the value and the attention to the branch lines. Much like we have, big box retailers, for a while they're overtaking the thinking and pushing out small local hardware stores, shoe stores, retail stores, which are now we're finding, as part of a community, you want to have those small stores. That becomes the fabric of a downtown community in which to build the whole town around. And I thought, well, boy, we really want to build out this branch line network and bring capital in right from the whole network, and that is really how the whole railroad system could thrive much better and serve the continent better. In answering your question about what was hard about it, it was that what I was advocating for and demonstrating in bringing capital to these smaller railroads went against the business model that was the dominant model of the rail industry. Oh. And so there you got into all of the political intrigue that whenever anyone comes into an industry with innovation, has to be faced and dealt with. And I've dealt with a lot in that area.
Well, can you share a little bit about your experience working with people in Washington or in, I guess, local political circles that in efforts to get this financing together?
Sure. The railroad industry had, for a number of decades, adopted an approach toward federal government wherein they wanted to stay out of the attention of Congress as much as possible. And instead of being there proactively communicating and educating Congress on the value and benefits of rail transportation, they were not communicating. And we had the understanding of people in Congress and the executive branch really influenced by the trucking industry, who has a very active lobby, and that is what Congress was seeing. So I decided when I realized that we would start going to Washington ourselves and establish direct relationships. And really the doors and the halls of Congress and the executive branch, to our delight, and just opened wide because of the way that we were bringing this issue. And if you'd like to, I could say more about that.
Yeah, whatever you feel like you can share about whatever went on in Washington, I'd love to hear, and I'm sure our listeners would as well.
Well, that's great. That's great. It's one of my favorite topics because I think it's really gives us hope for what's possible in the United States, particularly at this moment. Well, we found that when you approach Washington, as we were, as gentlemen, and excuse me, I haven't found the non-gender parallel to as gentlemen, as good people. When we went there as speaking what I call grounded in logic, intelligence, and humanity, folks really were riveted to what we had to say, and it's a lot of that was the power of rail transportation. Rail is inherently good for any modern, well-functioning society. And carrying that message in a way that wasn't driven by any we weren't out to get something for the railroad industry. We were out to educate Congress and the executive branch about the benefits of having rail, the role of railroads increased in our overall transportation system. So we weren't there on behalf of a client that was paying us money. We were funding it ourselves, and we went there to communicate and educate. And we would literally see people in the folks we'd meet with, chiefs of staffs and legislative directors, congressmen and senators themselves. They would get to the 10-minute point in a meeting. And for anybody that's gone to Washington, somebody will have schooled you in that you're supposed to get your whole point across in 10 minutes because that's how much time they give anybody coming from the outside. And we would see them physically sort of do all the motions of packing up and closing up a meeting with their papers and notebooks and such. And then at 12 minutes, they'd settle back down again.
Wow.
And, yeah. we'd be there, 45 minutes later, still speaking with, I'll never forget Congressman Jerry Nadler sitting there with staff coming in 3 times in a row to pull him out of an hour-long meeting with us, and we had just met him. And we found that, and people, we know what I'm going to say to be true, because they would say to us, Michael, we came to Washington to make a contribution. There's so little opportunity here. It's so the system really gets us down, but we're really empowered that you came here with this approach. And anything we can do for you, this office is available to you.
So they really understood it, it sounds like.
Very much so. Very much so. Go ahead.
Well, I was just curious. You said that the rail industry made a decision a while ago to not have a big voice in Washington. Do you know why they would have done that?
There's if we go back to the moment in North American history when really the only way to effectively travel long distances was on a railroad. Mm-hmm. There were next to no roads. The roads that there were muddy and all kinds of barriers. And lo and behold, we started having the internal combustion engine empowering individual vehicles, and we had this possibility of an alternative form of transportation to railroads. And plus we needed to build out more of our transportation system to get off of the rail lines. And so the road system really took off in the early 20th century. And at that moment, given our competitive landscape for business and commerce, instead of integrating the 2 modes of transportation most effectively, we pitted them against each other.
Oh.
So as we ended up with a fantastic road system, throughout the 20th century, the rail system had challenge after challenge. And I think they developed a sort of a siege mentality. And, there was increasing regulation, strangling regulation and regulation that didn't really understand what it took to run rail system effectively and productively and profitably. And they just came to see government as the enemy. And they also came to see, communities as a problem. Those darn people. And, now they have, in the last 10 years, they have endeavored to relate more positively all the way around. But now we have the legacy of a trucking system and freight highway system that is, 10 times the revenue of our railroad system, even though railroads, are so effective at moving heavy weight across land. So I think that's why the rail industry, took this kind of nothing good was going to come out of government, so let's just stay away from them as much as we can. I always likened it to a child that hides behind a sofa with their feet sticking out side, thinking that they're hiding, when you just can't hide a railroad system. It's here, and there's so much to be gained by all of us working together to address the multifaceted challenges of building out and expanding our rail system, which I want to say is the most productive freight rail system in the world. We have an outstanding freight rail system. Our message is that through coordination and collaboration across all stakeholder groups and making investments that aren't based on winner, those with the most money and the most power win, that we actually could double and triple our use of rail transportation within a balanced transportation system.
Well, that's so interesting. And when we come back, we're up on a break. I want to talk about how this might apply to other industries. But I'm just curious, what your perspective is, because it seems like the trucking industry it's easier to be a sole owner because you've got use of the highways. So many people could start trucking companies. They don't have to work together. But the railroad, inherently, you've got a partner, right? Because there's nowhere to go if you want to get a long distance and don't own the tracks. Is that a fair statement or one of the challenges?
Yeah, I love that question. The railroads, we have the benefit of privately owned railroads in the United States. They pay taxes, real estate taxes on their right-of-way. They maintain their right-of-way, so it's an important component of our infrastructure system that does not cost us or the government, whereas we have a highly subsidized highway system for moving freight, and that plays all kinds of havoc on the economics of and the supposed competition between railroads and trucks. It's
the playing field's not really even, is what you're saying.
No, and it's an interesting thing about transportation. We have such significant subsidization of transportation, whether it's that we don't have a carbon tax, hardly anywhere in the world, and it means that long distance transportation, that essentially is one of the driving forces of globalization, we're not really pricing into the marketplace all the costs of air pollution, congestion, and road infrastructure.
So I wondered if there's other types of industries or sectors in our economy where this same dynamic is happening, where it's maybe too much benefit to a small group of people and not benefiting the greater good. Do you have some other examples that you could share along those lines?
Well, I'll do my best. That's a great question, and it's my experience that across the most important areas of society, whether it's medicine, power generation and distribution, forestry management, agriculture, that we tend to rely on and think that somehow competition is going to bring forward the best products and services in service to society. And that what happens in reality is that we're continually bouncing back and forth between who wins in that particular moment in history and in the competitive landscape. And that's really insufficient to delivering, particularly now when we have a heightened realization that the external impacts of these large industrial systems are really what's causing the most problem. That for all the good we get from agriculture, we can no longer afford to have polluted rivers from too much fertilizer. For all the good we get from high-tech medicine that produces a lot of profits for those manufacturers and deliverers of that technology, that we now need to have medical systems that include alternative healing modalities. Mm-hmm. And competition is a stagnating force in those arenas, because it's not that high-tech Western medicine is bad and alternative medicine is good, or preventative medicine is all good. It's that we need all of it. And competition in the marketplace doesn't allow for the kinds of synergies and integration and collaboration that we need to take advantage of the efficiencies that are available from alternative methods and new methods and innovation. And so in each of these major arenas, part of I'd say the biggest part of the problem or a big part of the solution is that we need to unshackle ourselves from relying on competition. That is takes more than just, even you and I talking about it, as much as we hope that President Obama and Vladimir Putin are listening to us. We've built up our key regulatory systems around competition and antitrust, so that, at the core of the government systems that we rely on to, quote, regulate competition, they're organized around adjudication and punishment and dispute resolution. Not dispute resolution, just regulating, restricting, punishing, and that we haven't yet installed forums and methodologies for the kind of collaboration we're talking about, particularly here in the United States. Well, in many parts of the world, we make industrial coordination and collaboration illegal.
Wow. That's fascinating. Well, and so this may tie in, but you once said to me, capitalism is an economic system that drives capital towards the least efficient mode within our major commercial systems. And that seems to go against the option of capitalism being a force for best practices and products. So is that where the tension is?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think, and that's really at the heart of why I saw the railroad industry, with such an inherent good that it provides to our country and yet underutilized, that we really needed to solve the issue of capital moving toward the least efficient modes. I think, simply put, capital right now goes to where the inefficiencies are so often where the profit is, the consumables. They're in transportation, asphalt and concrete roadways and rubber tires have tremendous amount of friction. That's why they're both wearing out all the time. And that's where the capital flows to. More asphalt, more concrete, more rubber tires. And railroads as a business, as an industry, at its core, takes advantage of the almost frictionless relation between a hard steel wheel and a hard steel rail. These basic elements of our earth that, when put underneath the still great invention of the wheel, allows you to move heavy weight so much more efficiently. So there's the whole dynamic of capitalism that, when we really tell the truth about it, doesn't flow toward the most efficient modes. It flows toward, in this system, companies that can somehow dominate a marketplace or a system or an industry and hold on to, that control and play it out for, years and decades.
So it sounds like you could characterize the railroad industry, even though it's an older industry, as more of a green industry, really, or sustainable, right?
It's, yes, so much. It's, yes. I always say there's very few public policy issues that are as clear as the efficiency of rail transportation, and so it therefore provides quite an interesting case study on why it isn't invested in and funded so much more, and that when we bring the proper light to this issue over the coming years, as an extension of the groundwork we've laid in On Track America, it's going to be a model for all other industries, where, as if we think about moving capital in a way that improves the whole system not just a project here and a project there. And I can say, so much of how we're approaching infrastructure now, we keep relying on competitive application programs where we pit states and projects against each other.
Right.
And then we decide which individual projects we'll give money to, rather than thinking of what do we need for the whole system to be more efficient. We would get much better return on our capital that way than relying on competition and then picking individual projects.
Michael, you really focused on finance as a way of working with collaboration, and usually that's kept very secret, but you're often speaking and publishing all the details about what you're doing. What drives you to share about your work?
I think that we'll all be much more intelligent, and we'll be more intelligent as a society and a civilization when we take the lid off of what we are individually doing and make the system around sharing best practices, making discoveries, and quickly proliferating the results of that discovery. I think we're seeing that with the open source software movement, where you can still be profitable and you don't have to keep your ideas and your thoughts so close to the vest and control the whole process. If it's a good idea, people will embrace it. People will see you as a leader, as a knowledge leader in an area. And my commitment in finance is to expand railroads' access to capital and rail projects' access to capital. When and if that happens dramatically, I can move on to other things. It's a big world. There's lots of issues and situations that need addressing. And so I am out to not create a finance model that only I get to benefit from or my company and our clients, but the whole industry and the whole world gets to benefit from. So I believe that I should share it and that we should move toward a commercial system where that's the name of the game. We're all about making things more efficient, and then we can all go to the beach at some point, hopefully.
Well, so what is your vision for the world? Like, what would be needed to bring that into fruition?
My vision is that coordination and collaboration for the sustainable well-being of all becomes the fundamental operating principle of all economies and governments and societies. That we adopt for our commercial activity and for our governance coordination and collaboration, and for all. So I am endeavoring through my activities, exploring in business the benefits of collaboration to create a model for how business and government can relate in all industries and all societal issues. And it's my intention that this becomes an international, that it gets embraced internationally, that we move toward new constitutions and governing systems grounded in coordination and collaboration across stakeholder groups.
Wow, I would love to see that happen. So I mentioned at the beginning that you're actually developing a software that can help organizations, private and public entities to work together. Can you tell us a little bit about the software and what's going on with it and where you see it going?
Yes, yeah, sure. We're in development, and this is a concept that we teased out over the last 10 years, working with government groups and industry groups, often bringing them together to explore, what do people like most in a well-facilitated in-person meeting? Mm. And how can we create that dynamic, both in in-person meetings, but also primarily online, mm-hmm. not necessarily with what's called synchronous time frame, where everyone has to be in the meeting at the same time, but how can you have what are called asynchronous interactions, where people can participate in a dialogue at their convenience, yet the dialogue builds and is organized and is facilitated in the way that we like best about in-person facilitated meetings. And we're developing the software platform for that process.
Well, so what is it called? Can you share that?
Sure. It's called Enact.
Okay.
And the company is called Enact Solutions. The movement is called Enact, that will house and promote this. And that's E-NACT. Mm-hmm. We're very excited about it. I mean, this is really out of the observations that I made during all the years of interacting with Congress, executive branch, foundations in Washington, state governments, local governments, and business and the rail industry. I found that there's no lack of intelligence. Mm. There are so many intelligent, experienced, thoughtful, and committed people. Mm-hmm. It's what our methods and for coordinating that intelligence and building that intelligence and creating the kind of synergistic experiences and dialogues and interactions from that intelligence are woefully short. And that's really what we need, and that as much as we've had the great promise of the internet, that promise hasn't been realized yet, and that we really needed to invent the program to that can effectively and efficiently make use of people's time in thoughtful, multifaceted dialogues.
So it's actually taking what you learned from the private sector and from the public sector and building it to coordinate together. That sounds amazing. Is it something that will sit on a cloud, or are there different ways that it'll be accessed?
Sure. Well, we will be developing it in what's called the open source model, so that once we complete our development, and actually, I mean, even before completing the development, it'll be available for people to start contributing to and teasing out and adapting for multiple uses. And we have the team in place, and we're in high gear on this, and we're planning to begin convening the kinds of large scale multi-stakeholder dialogues in the transportation field.
That's great. We're about out of time, so I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to hear that this is coming, and I want to thank you so much for being my guest today. I hope you'll come back. Maybe we can talk about this. The software sounds like just an exercise in collaboration once you launch it. So I want to have you come back and give us an update. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Olivia. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
You're welcome. So next week, we're going to explore holacracy purposeful organization through social technology with, as he calls himself, recovering CEO and partner at Holacracy One, Brian Robertson. So be sure to check my host page on voiceamerica.com for full details. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Thank you for tuning to Quantum Business Insights. See you next week.